Chapter 3 of What I Believe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Believe by Count Leo Tolstoy, translated from the Russian by Konstantin Popov, read by David Barnes. Chapter 3. To affirm that the Christian doctrine refers only to personal salvation and has no bearing upon state affairs is a great error. To say so is but to assert an audacious, groundless, most evident untruth, which a moment's serious reflection suffices to destroy. Well, I say to myself, I will not resist evil. As a private man, I will let myself be struck. But what am I to do if an enemy invades my native land, or other nations oppress it? I am called upon to take part in a struggle against evil, to go and kill. The question immediately arises, which will be serving God, and which will be serving toga? To go or not to go? Suppose I am a peasant. I am chosen as the senior member of my village, as judge, as juryman. I am bound to take an oath, to judge and to punish. Fellow creature, what am I to do? I have again to choose between the law of God and the law of man. Or let us say I am a monk and live in a monastery. The neighbouring peasants have taken possession of the hay we had mown for our own use. I am sent to take part in a struggle against evil, to prosecute these men. I have again to choose between the laws of God and the laws of man. None of us can evade the demand for such a decision. To say nothing of the class of society that I belong to, military men, judges, administrators, whose whole lives are passed in resisting evil, there is not a single private individual, be he ever so insignificant, who has not had to choose between serving God by fulfilling his commandments, or serving the toga in the government institutions of his country. Our private lives are interwoven with the organization of the state, and the latter requires unchristian duties of us, contrary to the commandments of Christ. At the present time, the military service, which is obligatory on all, and the participation of each as jurymen in the courts of law, place this dilemma with striking clarity before all. Each man is called upon to take up an instrument of murder, a gun, a sword. Even if he does not kill a fellow creature, he loads the gun and sharpens the sword, that is, he is ready to commit murder. Each citizen is called upon to enter the courts of law, to take part in judging and punishing his fellow creature. That is, each must renounce the doctrine of Christ that teaches us not to resist evil. The grenadier's question, the gospel or the military code, the law of God or the law of man, it still stands before us all, as it did in the time of Samuel. It stood before Christ and his disciples. It now stands before all those who wish to be Christians. It stood before me. The doctrine of Christ, which teaches love, humility, and self-denial, had always attracted me, but I found a contrary law, both in the history of the past and in the present organization of our lives, a law repugnant to my heart, my conscience, and my reason, but one that flattered my animal instincts. I knew that if I accepted the doctrine of Christ, I should be forsaken, miserable, persecuted and sorrowing, as Christ tells us his followers will be. I knew that if I accepted that law of man, I should have the approbation of my fellow men, I should be at peace and in safety. All possible sophisms would be at hand to quiet my conscience, and I should laugh and be merry, as Christ says. I felt this, and therefore I avoided a closer examination of the law of Christ, and tried to comprehend it in a way that should not prevent my still leading my animal life. But, finding that impossible, I desisted from all attempts at comprehension. This led me into a state of mental obscurity, which now seems surprising to me. For instance, let me recall my former interpretation of the words, "Do not judge, and you shall not be judged," Matthew 7:1. "Do not judge, and you shall not be judged. Do not condemn, and you shall not be condemned," Luke 6:37. The court of law of which I was a member, and which guarded my property and my personal safety, seemed to me so unquestionably sacred that it never came into my mind that the words, "Do not condemn," could have any higher meaning than that we are not to speak evil of our fellow men. The idea never occurred to me that these words could have any reference to courts of law, district courts, criminal courts, assizes, courts of peace, etc. When I at last took in the real meaning of the words, "Do not resist evil," the question arose in my mind, what would Christ's opinion be of all these courts of law? And seeing clearly that he would reject them, I asked myself, do these words mean that we are not only never to speak evil of our brethren, but that we are not to condemn them to punishment by our human institutions of justice? In the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 6, verses 37 to 39, these words come immediately after the commandment not to resist evil, and to return good for evil. After the words, "Be merciful, even as your Father in heaven is merciful," we read, "Do not judge, and you shall not be judged. Do not condemn, and you shall not be condemned." Doesn't it mean that we are not only never to condemn our brother in word, that is, to speak evil of him, but that we are not to institute courts of law for the condemnation of a fellow creature to punishment? I said to myself, and no sooner did this question arise than both my heart and my reason answered in the affirmative. I know now how greatly this way of understanding the words surprises everyone at first. I was surprised too. To show how far I formerly was from the true interpretation of these words, I may here mention a foolish saying of mine, of which I am now heartily ashamed. Even after having become a believer, and having recognized the divinity of the gospel, I used to say jokingly, on meeting with a friend who was an attorney or a judge, "So you go on judging, and yet isn't it said, 'Do not judge, and you shall not be judged'?" I was so firmly convinced that these words had no other meaning than that we were not to speak ill of one another, that I did not see the blasphemy of my own words. So sure was I that the words were not to be taken in a literal sense, that I used them, jokingly, in their true application. I shall give a circumstantial account of the way in which all my doubts as to the real sense of these words were dispersed, and how it became evident to me that Christ forbids all human institutions of justice, and that he could mean nothing else. The first point that struck me when I understood the commandment, "Do not resist evil," in its true meaning, was that human courts were not only contrary to this commandment, but in direct opposition to the whole doctrine of Christ, and that therefore he must certainly have forbidden them. Christ says, "Do not resist evil." The sole object of courts of law is to resist evil. Christ enjoins us to return good for evil. Courts of law return evil for evil. Christ says, "Make no distinction between the just and the unjust." Courts of law do nothing else. Christ says, "Forgive all. Forgive not once, not 7 times, but forgive without end. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you." Courts of law do not forgive, but they punish. They do not do good, but evil to those whom they call the enemies of society. So, the true sense of the doctrine